When building a REST API, there are 4 ways your API can receive input from client applications. They are headers, path parameters, query parameters, and request body. Can you pick any one of the 4 ways to receive inputs from your client applications? Or is there a reason why we prefer one way over another to pass input to the REST API? That's what we will be exploring in this video. Let's make use of an example before we continue our discussion. Let's say that we want to build a REST API that returns the list of movies. The REST API needs some inputs before it can return the list of movies. The inputs that this REST API requires are the movie year and the movie genre. The possible values for the movie year are 2015, 2016, 2022, 2023, etc. The possible values for genre are action, adventure, comedy, horror, sci-fi, etc. Let us also assume that this REST API is secured, which simply means that every client application must provide a valid username and password to the REST API. Otherwise, the REST API wouldn't return the list of requested movies. Now the question arises, how should the API client applications pass all this information to the REST API? There are 4 possible ways to pass input to this REST API. We can pass all the 4 inputs using path parameters. We can use query parameters also. A third option is to make use of HTTP headers. And we can also send all the 4 inputs via HTTP request body. So what's the best way to send inputs to the REST API? Let's find out in the next slide. So as I have already mentioned, I can pass the movie year and movie genre to the API using path parameters. The variables in the path section of the URL are known as the path parameters or path variables. I can also pass the movie year and movie genre using query parameters, as shown in the second URL. Both approaches are acceptable and correct. Path parameters are considered cleaner or reader-friendly compared to URLs containing query parameters. Look into clean URLs if you are interested in exploring the idea of clean URLs further. Coming back to the original discussion, notice that I haven't included the other 2 pieces of data. Remember, this API is secured, which means that we need to pass username and password to this API as well. Otherwise, the API will not return the list of movies. So can I include the username and password in the URL either as path parameters or query parameters? Yes, I can. But I won't do that because that is not a common practice. There is actually a dedicated header field called authorization. So it is best to make use of that field when you pass authorization info. This video is not about API security best practices, so I won't go into the details. If you decide not to use the authorization field in the header, then you can add a custom header for the username and a custom header for sending the password. So why use header? Headers are used for sending metadata. Metadata is the data that is separate from the actual data, but it gives us more information about the actual data that is being exchanged between the REST API and the application that is calling the REST API. Headers help us keep the metadata separate from the actual data. A frequently used header is content type, which is used for informing the type of data being sent, such as HTML, text, zip file, XML, JSON, or some other type of file or data. Another frequently used header is content length, which informs us about the size of the data included in the HTTP message. You can introduce custom headers also. For example, if you want all API clients to include their name in every HTTP request, then you can introduce a mandatory custom header such as caller name or anything else that makes sense to you. Let's say that you go against the convention and decide to build your API in such a way that it expects username, password, and the caller name in the body of the HTTP request. This will work with POST PUT request, but won't work with HTTP GET requests because GET requests do not have a body. If you decide to use path parameters or query parameters to send the username, password, and the caller name to the API, then it would be okay if you have other path parameters or query parameters. But POST and PUT requests generally make use of the HTTP request body to send data to the REST API. So if you have different types of APIs, you can keep the experience consistent by making use of HTTP headers for passing metadata and authorization data or authorization tokens. Now let's also discuss why don't we use the HTTP request body for passing the year, genre, username, password, and caller name. There are a couple of ways I can answer that question. First, if you're building a GET API, then remember that HTTP GET request doesn't have a request body. So the only way to send data is by making use of path parameters, query parameters, or headers when interacting with a GET API. And we have already discussed that it is a common practice to use headers only for passing metadata, not the actual data. So that leaves us with only two options. Either we can use path parameters or we can use query parameters, or a combination of both when interacting with the GET API. It also makes sense to use path parameters and query parameters when the data you are sending is simple, like one or more string values or key value pairs. Path parameters and query parameters are a good choice when sending simple data to the REST API. But if you have complex data, such as HTML, XML, JSON, that is nested or has parent-child data that is nested or has parent-child relationships, then that's when it makes sense to utilize the body section of the HTTP request. So if the API is expecting to receive complex data from the client applications, then the API cannot be a GET API. You will have to develop a POST or a PUT API because POST and PUT requests have a body section where the client can insert the complex data for your REST API to process further. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found this discussion useful, then please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel, as this would help me gauge interest in the content I'm producing.